Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into some really deep stuff about how, the US just doesn't seem to really get China, right?
Absolutely. It's like there's this whole layer of historical context that we effortlessly overlook.
Yeah, exactly. You know, what really stands out is the perspective from someone like Victor Gao, who actually got to work with Deng Xiaoping. It's like you get to see firsthand the way China thinks.
Right? And when you mention Deng Xiaoping, I mean, his geopolitical view completely reshaped how we understand China's strategy for decades.
Yeah, it's like his experience working directly with influential figures really colors his perspective on today's international dynamics. And then you have the
Yep.
massive backdrop of China's 8,000-year history.
Oh, for sure. That kind of history, it's not something you consider when you're just looking at current events.
Exactly. And that historical depth, it shapes a mindset that sees the world in a much longer view. It's like, you're not just dealing with a few years, but rather thousands of years of development.
Right? Yeah, and what's really interesting is how this historical context gets pushed aside in the US narrative, almost like they ignore it in favor of a more short sighted approach.
Totally. And that goes hand in hand with another point, the whole fair trade versus free trade debate. You remember when Victor pointed out there will be no fair trade without free trade. It's like America expects
Yes,
rules to
indeed.
be equal, but then sometimes forgets the complexities behind it all.
It's fascinating because while on the surface that slogan sounds fair, it actually underscores a deeper, nuanced approach that China might take towards trade and their own economic strategies.
Exactly. And then we get into the whole question of will the US actually ask for China's help to, say, reindustrialize? It's like there's this tug of war between, competition and potential cooperation.
Yeah, that's a real kicker. I mean, on one hand, there's plenty of tension and mistrust, and on the other, the reality is um, both sides could benefit from some collaboration, especially in manufacturing and technology.
Exactly. And then Victor also touches on the term decoupling, which he pretty firmly suggests is just a misnomer. It's like, decoupling, it's not like flipping a switch when in reality you're just rewiring some connections while still
Right?
being intertwined.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people think of decoupling as a complete and total separation, but in practice, economic interdependencies remain deep.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole criticism of US short sightedness. It really comes through in the discussion. The tendency of the US, to not fully grasp the long term view that China naturally has.
Yep. I'd even argue that this short sightedness sometimes results in policies that are more reactionary than strategic.
And on that note, there's this curious observation about not choosing sides, being a swing state, essentially suggesting don't choose, be a swing state.
Yeah, that's a
It
pretty
really
vivid
speaks to the
analogy.
idea of balancing influences rather than fully aligning with one camp.
Right, but I privately wonder, isn't that a bit idealistic? I mean, if you're constantly swinging between sides, doesn't that create its own set of challenges politically?
Good point, but think of it as a strategic neutrality that can serve as a mediator of sorts. It's an interesting proposal where not choosing could actually lead to a more balanced global discourse.
True. And although I see the appeal, I do think that such an approach might be too simplistic given the complexities at play.
That's a fair critique. It's like when you try to simplify something incredibly nuanced, you run the risk of losing some critical elements. But continuing on, Victor also delves into curing the misunderstanding between the US and China. This is where mutual
Right?
learning and communication really become essential.
Definitely, we often see the US framing China's actions through an overly adversarial lens, whereas there's a whole layer of history and cultural context being missed.
Exactly. And speaking of framing, there's also that intriguing segment on America's so called tail wagging wars. It's almost like Beijing sees the US as chasing its own tail, constantly embroiled in conflicts that are more about projection than concrete
Yes.
outcomes.
Right. And this further reinforces how America's own system might actually be shackling itself, getting caught up in internal contradictions.
Absolutely. And that idea reappears later when Victor questions if the US is shackled by its own system. It's like The very mechanisms that make the US strong might also be its biggest limitation.
Hmm. Exactly. The doctrine and policies that have driven their success could be the same forces that limit their vision for the future.
And then finally, there's that point about China, never having stopped defending the two-state solution, and even more interestingly, how it views Southeast Asia.
Yep,
It's like China sees Southeast Asia not just as a neighbor, but as an integral part of the global conversation.
right. And that perspective is so often underplayed in Western media, which tends to focus narrowly on the US versus China narrative.
Exactly. And when you consider that Southeast Asia has 700 million people and a massive economy, it's, well, simply too significant to ignore.
For sure, it's fascinating how the discussion blends deep historical context with contemporary challenges. It's like rethinking global politics on a much broader, long term canvas.
Yes, and it's like we're invited to see the world not through a lens of immediate rewards, but through an understanding that spans millennia, which honestly
Right?
is a perspective most fail to appreciate.
It really shifts our focus from tactical skirmishes to strategic positioning over the long haul.
And that discussion about trade, decoupling, and even fair trade is just one part of this broader narrative of misinterpretation. It almost feels like the US just sees snapshots of policy without the full cinematic context that history affords China.
Yes, indeed. Exactly. It's like watching a movie trailer and thinking you know the whole plot, when in reality, you miss the director's commentary that explains each detail.
Haha, that's a great analogy. And if we consider this in light of current policies, there's so much debate about the balance between competition and cooperation that really needs this historical framing to be fully understood.
I agree, though I still think that sometimes this historical framework might be used to justify actions that overlook modern nuances. There's a slight risk of overly romanticizing the past.
Fair enough, and that's definitely a point to challenge. While, yes, the historical perspective is crucial, we should be cautious about letting it dictate policy without regard for changing contexts.
Right? Exactly. An imbalance there could lead to missteps in both international strategy and domestic policy.
And circling back to the idea of America's misunderstanding of China, it seems that much of this stems from not appreciating the cultural, historical, and long term strategic elements behind every decision.
Yep, absolutely. When you peel back all layers, it's all interconnected: history, economics, politics, and culture.
Right? It's like you're peering behind the curtain, and suddenly every decision, every diplomatic move has roots that go back centuries.
And this really reminds us how vital it is to have such nuanced discussions, rather than just quick sound bites or oversimplified narratives.
Exactly. And this conversation really pushes us to think critically about how we interpret global events, especially when major players like China are involved.
Yeah. It definitely leaves one reflecting on how much more there is beneath the surface when relating history to current events.
Spot on. And that's a wrap on our deep dive today. It's clear that understanding China requires us to, well, step back, look at the bigger picture, and really appreciate the layers of history and strategy that define this complex relationship with the US.
Yep, absolutely.